Pozwolę sobie zaprosić Norwegii do wzięcia udziału w ostatniej prezentacji w naszym panelu. Bardzo proszę pana doktora Toma Grimsrunda z Departamentu Badań Norweskim i Rejestrze Nowotworów w Instytucie Badań nad Nowotworami wśród społeczeństwa. Bardzo proszę, panie doktorze, o przedstawienie nam swojej prezentacji.
It's the wrong one. I'm sorry. Okay. Can you take it? Yeah. This should be the one. I think, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And thanks also to my fellow Scandinavian speakers from Denmark and Sweden, who have covered the topics very fine. It's a great pleasure to listen to them. I have no formal representation here. I just come as a scientist, sort of representing the scientific community and also the Nordic or Scandinavian activities on this field of cancer among firefighters. In a way, it's natural that Denmark and Sweden come first and then Norway at the end, because that's, in fact, like it has been on very many fields. As you know, there are similarities between Poland and Norway, because we were 400 years under the Danish king, and then 100 years under the Swedish king, until we regained our situation as a country on our own for about 100 years ago. And Norway has always been a quite poor country until the last decades, when the petroleum era came. So in the scientific field, Denmark and Sweden have always come in front. But that leaves us with an opportunity to try to do it even more better, to learn from the experience in Sweden and Denmark and try to push the knowledge a little further. A few words about myself. I'm a medical doctor, and I've been working 11 years as a company physician, company doctor, with surveillance of health among workers and practical preventive work. And that's why the two speakers I'm very pleased to hear how very nicely they talked about these issues now. But the last 20 years, I've been working at the Cancer Registry of Norway with scientific work at the research department of the Norwegian Cancer Registry, which is a national registry for where we record every new case of cancer in the Norwegian population. And they have similar cancer registries in Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. So there's good opportunities for cooperative work. So that has, and then as a scientist at the Cancer Registry, my main activity has been to identify causal factors of cancer, mainly occupational causes of cancer, and that has been what is very motivating, because this knowledge is really the basic thing when you want to prevent cancer. And but another issue that I've been involved in is handling of cancer clusters, because as a sort of a institution of expertise, as the cancer registry is, we often get questions about, oh, please, there is so much cancer around at my workplace or in my residential area, and so we are very worried. And then some of these questions come to my desk, and then it's a challenge for me to look into it and try to decide whether there is a reason to worry, or perhaps it is just what we would regard as a normal occurrence of cancer, and which really it is what we should expect, and there is no real we don't see any real reason to be worried. So this is sort of the situation that I'm working with, this trying to sort out whether this cancer occurrence is caused by a factor or an exposure, or whether this is just what we would have to expect, because we're all people, we all can get ill and we all die eventually. And one important thing about cancer clustering is that as we live and get older, more and more of us really get cancer. I think 90% of the cancer diagnoses are made among people older than 50 years. So it's the picture of our surroundings really change throughout life. It's not very much cancer when we are in our 20s and 30s and 40s, but as we get older and come towards retirement, it is quite common to have a cancer. And eventually perhaps 30 and 40% will have a cancer diagnosis. So that's sort of the situation that we work with, and it's challenging, really challenging. And there is no simple way to decide whether it is sort of a random thing or whether it is caused. So we have to. It's like I think Forrest said. It's a puzzle. So we have to rely on different information, different kinds of information. And so my field is what we call epidemiology, which is the distribution of cancer cases in populations. Of course, the best thing would be to do experiments. That's the scientific utmost approach. But with people, you cannot do experiments. You have to rely on observation of what is going on in historical time. So that's sort of limiting what we can do, but we can get quite a number of answers through trying to aggregate experience from history, and then we have to supply with other approaches, as has already been talked about. So this cancer epidemiology is sort of a field lying between medicine and chemistry and physics and statistics. So it's a sort of a involving many specialities and many expertise fields. Okay. A short greeting from my boss and colleague, Kristina Kjærem, who some of you know. She was not able to come. I was asked yesterday by one of the attendants of the meeting, do you believe in this connection between firefighting and cancer? And of course, for me as a scientist, this is not a yes or no answer. So I think it's difficult when it comes to this short and concentrated question. So but I would say that some of the findings that have been done in several nations around the world, in different societies, they are quite alarming. Although there are, of course, occupational groups that have higher risks, have experienced higher risks, perhaps 3 times the normal, 4 times the normal, and even higher. So perhaps the firefighters are not the worst occupational group, but some of the findings are really worrisome. So then the issue needs attention. I think that is pretty clear. And sometimes it is also necessary to act and to try to prevent before knowledge is complete. So that's sort of my question to this. Do you believe? I think there's a little more nuances, but I think it's important, an important issue. And besides, when we find out things about firefighters, it could be very useful for the rest of society, because some of these exposures that firefighters experience in quite substantial degree, they could affect the whole population in lower degree, but we are many people, and then it could potentially be a societal health issue, a public health issue. So that's another aspect of this thing, which I think it's very important to stress, and I think it's a very valuable thing that firefighters have come with this, raised these questions. I will talk a little about the results and the scientific situation, but I will try to explain a little about cancer epidemiology. And I usually say that cancer epidemiology, my field, it rests on three elements or three pillars. You have to have knowledge about the individuals. Who are we talking about? Because cancer is a disease that can come perhaps 2 years after exposure, perhaps 20 or 40 or 50 years after exposure. It is important to know who are we talking about so that we can follow him or her during the years afterwards. The second is exposures. What type of exposures are the individuals experiencing? And the third thing is, what about the cancer diagnosis? Do we know who has cancer, who has not cancer? We have to know who that is and the type of the cancer. And whenever one of these pillars is weak, it is restricting our ability to evaluate the situation. So the Nordic countries are known for being able to track people through years and decades because you have this system of unique personal identity numbers, and we also have good high quality cancer data in our registries, but at the same time it is a limitation that the number of inhabitants and perhaps the number of firefighters is quite low. So it's very important that we can do cooperation across the borders. I will show you just this graphs that illustrates the cancer incidence, the occurrence of cancer in the Norwegian population throughout almost 60 years. You can see at the left is the cancer types among males, and the upper line is the blue one is the prostate cancer, which is increasing, but especially after 1990 it's increasing very much. And that's the introduction of the prostate specific antigen, which is a blood test that really can not diagnose cancer, but it can sort of give us an indication that it might be a cancer. And that has really sort of doubled the occurrence of prostate cancer. So if people do as I do, I have not taken a prostate-specific antigen test, then I would have the risk as it was before 1990. But if you take the prostate-specific antigen, you will sort of, it will look like you have a higher risk. So that's one of the problems. But we can see that because we have population data. And you also see the orange line, which is melanoma of the skin, increasing enormously through the years. So that's another thing, that we have changes and trends in the population, which makes it quite challenging to say what is the cause of disease in specific occupational groups. So I won't elaborate this very much, but I think the exposure issue is the most challenging thing about firefighters, because they experience a number of different types of exposures, from dusts and smoke, liquids, gases and radiation. They might experience all these, and they can be exposed through the lungs and through the skin, and it's not some of these exposures are difficult to observe, and it's necessary to measure and to acquire new knowledge about them, because that's sort of the weakest of the three legs is the exposures. So that is mandatory that we increase our knowledge about this issue. Besides, it is this have been said before, it's intermittent exposure. One fire incident is different from the next one in duration and in the chemical composition and the materials that are combusted, and also the fire extinction methods change during time. So it's difficult when you're doing a historical evaluation to know what type of exposure these people have experienced. Besides, there are some exposures that are common, such as I've listed benzene, formaldehyde, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These compounds are carcinogenic and quite common. Benzene is a sort of extreme because it's so volatile that it disappears very quickly. On the other side, you have other types of chemicals that might rest in the body or be deposited in parts of the body. So it's a huge differences between all these exposures. I've listed some of them here that are known to be causing cancer in humans. But even if we know that these substances may cause cancer, you cannot automatically say that they are causing cancer in firefighters, because it has to be in high enough levels, or it has to be duration has to be long enough. So it's not self-evident that they will get cancer, even if we know that they are exposed from time to time. So not to say that we cannot say that it is unimportant, but it really takes some more research to say that this is a problem for firefighters. But apart from that, it is self-evident that you have to think prevention when you know that people are exposed to this. So this is a sort of a double situation. You cannot know for sure what effect is among these workers, but it is important to think preventive, and this, which has been explained in a very good way from the speakers here. I want to mention the dioxins at the bottom line here, the 2378 tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin, which is a difficult name, but it's a substance that had existed for half a century or some, but it was not until the 1970s that we were able to measure, because they are extremely toxic, but they occur in very low levels in the body, and so the knowledge about the harmful effects are not completely known, but it is known that some of these might cause cancer, and one of the interesting or alarming things is that these dioxins seem to rise the risk of all cancers, as sort of a general effect on cancers. So, and these substances do not disappear like benzene. They sort of deposited in the body, so they might exert their effects through years after exposure. So, what cancers should we expect when we know something about what exposures are met? Yeah, I would say from my experience and from the literature, we would expect that it could increase the risk of respiratory cancer, that is cancer of the lung, cancer of the larynx. You would expect that it could be an elevation of risk of blood cancer, leukemia and lymphoma. You would say that could elevate the risk of skin cancer, as Mr. Forrest talked about the chimney sweeps in the 18th century, which was a skin cancer on the scrotum, and which was shown experimentally, one of the first animal experiments with these substances on rabbit skin. So you would expect to see skin cancers. Perhaps you also would expect to see urinary tract cancer, cancer of the bladder. So, and what do we see? I shall comment on these specific cancers. Just mention the studies that we consider the most important ones. And starting 10 years ago with Lemaster's meta-analysis of 28 previous studies, and the IARC evaluation published in 2010. As IARC decided that it was a possible cause of cancer, that does not mean that it is not. It tells us that there is evidence of cancer risk among firefighters, and if you look at history, quite a number of carcinogens start as a possible carcinogen, and then when new research has been done, it is evaluated once more, and extremely rarely they are degraded as, no, it's not hazardous. Most of them are, you find better evidence, and you end up with a certain of the known cause of cancer. So that would be, from history, we would expect, I mean, you have this list of known carcinogens that you are exposed to, and you have, this is classified, the activity is classified as a possible risk of cancer. You would expect it to go in that direction. That would be sort of gut feeling. So, and there are a number of studies coming afterwards, and the last one, the Daniels, the American study, from firefighters in 3 major US cities, sort of introduces some improvement in the characterization of exposures. So that is, I think, an important contribution as well. Because some limitations in the exposure assessment is that it has been quite coarse and not very detailed. We just compare being ever a firefighter versus never a firefighter, or we compare the duration of employment and the period of employment. These are important things, but it's quite, I mean, it's not very detailed. So this the last American study by Daniels introduces more details by specifying the number of exposed days, the number of fires, or the number of fire hours experienced by each firefighter. So I will comment some of the cancer forms that we would expect to be elevated risk among, if given that the workers are exposed to the list of carcinogens that I have shown you. And the Daniels study from 2015 really shows that the more specified you make the exposures, there is evidence that there is increased risk of lung cancer. And you have also, in the older studies, you have evidence that there is some increased risk. And of course, as has been mentioned, I know that Swedish firefighters, they smoke less than the population. That's quite clear, but it's difficult to know how much that influences, but it would really be a question of picking the correct or the appropriate comparison group. So I mean, there is quite some evidence to supporting the idea that the exposures during firefighting might cause lung cancer. I just pick some of them, and then I will say a little about leukemia, which also in the Daniel's study from 2015, with a better exposure data, shows that there is some 30 to 50% increased risk of having leukemia. So it's you find consistent in all these 3 American cities, and you find that the exposure to the last 5 to 25 years are the most important, and this is things that you would expect with this cancer form. So I think it's the evidence of that leukemia might be a occupational cancer in firefighters has been strengthened already since the IARC evaluation in 2010. I also will say a few words about skin cancer, which is what we call a positive finding. That is, we find increased risk, significantly increased risk, both in the American studies, in the Nordic studies based on census data of occupation. You find it in the Australian study, and it is it is in harmony with known some of the exposures to polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and you have some other exposures as well that might increase the risk of non-melanoma. This is melanoma and non-melanoma skin cancer. So it's the red figures means that it is increased, and it's what we call statistical significant. So what about the other cancers? Because the list I showed you of the cancers that we would expect to see, it's quite short. We can talk about 30, 40 different cancer forms as a total. And what about such a thing as prostate cancer? It's a special problem because, as I showed you, the incidence or the occurrence of prostate cancer has increased. So it's really can be a result of what we call diagnostic pressure. So it's really difficult question to answer. And besides, there are not really very many known causes of prostate cancer. And if you look at the studies, some really do show that it is a 30% or up to 30% increased risk. But you look at Daniel's studies from 2015, he finds a significantly reduced risk, which is, it could be a coincidence that he doesn't find this, but it could also be that this is some sort of variation that is caused by other causes. It's a difficult thing to give a clear answer to. Yeah. As I told you, the Norwegian scientists, we are coming after the Swedish and Danish scientists, but we have applied for funding for a study where we would try to acquire a more detailed occupational history of Norwegian firefighters. We hope to be able to address the questions with a little more details than has been done before. We also would like to look at prostate cancer. And then you could ask me, why do you want to look at prostate cancer if you don't believe that it is a occupation, you don't really expect it to be an occupational disease? Yes, because prostate cancer is the most common cancer among men. So it is important to know whether there is a reason to worry. I will think that it is important. So I think it deserves to be, because there are signals that it could be a problem for firefighters. But I think it's important to say something about do our studies strengthen the belief, or do they support this idea, or do they sort of tell us that it is perhaps not really associated with the occupation? That's an important question. Additionally, we would like to look at some of the halogenated compounds, because that's sort of a new, rather new problem, and that should be addressed with measurements in serum or in blood in firefighters. Yeah. So our challenges would be to specify the periods and workplace and the activities, and to identify chemical compounds that are carcinogenic. So. And we have I just came to Warsaw yesterday from a Scandinavian meeting with the colleagues from Sweden and from Denmark. So we have contact already between the scientists in our neighboring countries, and there is also communication with a lot of institutions in Norway, and so we hope that we will be in position to add to the evidence of cancer causes in firefighters. So as a last message, I would like to say that I think society as a whole has a number of lessons to learn from the activity shown by the firefighters, because they have really succeeded in changing or directing the attention towards a problem that could potentially be important. I mean, it is important, of course, that those who protect us against fires, that they do that in the most secure way. But it can be also other benefits for society that this attention is directed to this. I think we should be very grateful for this initiative, this important initiative. Okay, thank you for your attention.